We're about to see if this works.
Okay.
Oh boy. We got a
Little delay there.
Let me mute that site. Okay. Great. So there's a link there. This is what we're gonna do.
Okay.
Okay. Watch the YouTube link for the live. We're just gonna do that because otherwise I'd have to get you on mobile to join me in the Facebook group. And that's kind of a pain in the butt.
Got it.
Okay. So assuming that this is all working, and we are going live to YouTube, which is fantastic. Tried to go live to Facebook, just hit some technical issue here. I've updated my computer. I've updated Zoom. I don't know if there's been some technical issue where now I can't go live into my own Facebook group anymore, but we will get that fixed at some later time. But tonight, I'm joined live by casting director Erica S. Bream. Erica, thank you so much for joining us in this live Q&A.
Sure, happy to be here.
So just to give everybody basically a brief understanding of, where you're at and where you come from, give us a little history lesson that brings us up to speed with how you are the casting director that you are.
Sure. So I live and work out of the Southeast now. I did start my career in Los Angeles. I lived and worked there for 17 years before moving here, and moved here late 2017 and have been working as a Southeast casting director, but also still with a foot in LA and New York and elsewhere since being here in the Southeast. And I know this is a group talking about self-tapes. I've been a big proponent of self-tapes for a very long time, long before I ever came to the Southeast, which is, of course, a self-tape market. It's a skill all in itself, and it's an important one to learn. It's not going anywhere anytime soon.
Yeah, I hear you. So yeah, you've seen this developing over time. I certainly know you've talked about it. You and I have actually, for those who don't know, have had a conversation on the podcast. It's a great conversation. You gave us a lot of insight and advice. I encourage people to check that out. But the Southeast has been a self-tape market for a while. Many people there. I've spoken to others who are in that market, both actors and folks who work on the casting side of things, and agents, in fact. Most of the actors there have been familiar with self-taping for a while. So when we hit this point, and I think you even said this on the podcast, where now we're in the pandemic and everyone's kind of scrambling, gosh, most of your actors were like, it was old hat for them. They were ready to go. What were some of the things? Yeah. What were some of the things that they were doing already that was maybe putting them ahead of the game that you were seeing that other actors had to catch up on? And maybe there are some fundamentals there that actors should just keep in their back pocket, because these are things that are not going to change, and it's always good to have those.
Sure. Well, they knew all the technical basics, right? Like they knew how to film on the devices they were using, whether it was a phone or a camera or whatever. They knew how best to light themselves. They knew that they needed a plain background. They knew to make sure that if they're doing their phone, that they're holding it that's position landscape and not, portrait. They knew all of those things, and with that knowledge, of course, comes confidence. And for people who are on a learning curve, or for people who frankly are technophobes, I am a technophobe, there's no judgment in that qualifier there. There were a lot of actors who, when they got self-tape requests prior to COVID, they would just go to a self-taping studio. And then they lost that ability or opportunity to do so once the pandemic hit and everything really had to shut down. So these folks in the Southeast have been embracing it for a really long time. they've been evolving with the technology. They
Mm.
have been shifting with the technology. And like I said, with that comes the ability. So when you get an audition, all you have to think about is the performance and the character work. Whereas folks in other markets who hadn't quite gotten there yet had to start at the beginning of, what do I film on? What kind of equipment do I need? Do I need equipment? How do I find readers? All of that stuff, which is stressful. It's really stressful. So, and then when virtual casting started happening, so casting via Zoom or EcoCast Live or We Audition or whatever, the actors in the Southeast, again, they're just unafraid of the tech.
Mm.
Obviously some people still are. Listen, I'm afraid of technology. I have to have my husband help me hold my hand through big technical changes. But they were ready to embrace it because they had the equipment. They're used to performing in their own home. They're used to dealing with all of that stuff. And I think it allowed them to be like, what's different,
Yeah.
and just kind of roll with it. So they definitely had a leg up, but they had a leg up in self-taping in general prior to the pandemic, just
Mm-hmm.
because they've been doing it so long as a larger group, as a larger market. Whereas a lot of actors that I came across in LA were still hesitant because they were like, well, I can just go into the room. So
Right. And
it's
New
just a
York
different
being the
ballgame.
same way
Yeah,
too, probably.
totally. And New York theater actors really had to adapt to performing for online and for self tapes and stuff like that. So it's not the same. It's not the same as live auditions. It does take practice. It does get better and easier the more you do it, the more confidence you build in it. And then before you know it, you can really appreciate the hell out of it. Because now, first of all, it kept all of us safe during this whole thing and allowed us to continue. So
Mm.
there's one thing. But even coming out of the pandemic, when it's going to be safe to travel again and things like that, every actor knows that if you book a trip, that's when you get an audition, or
Right.
that's when you book a job. And it used to be that if you went out of town on that vacation, you missed your audition opportunity, and that there goes that job. And now everybody's got their little setups and they have confidence, or they're gaining confidence in self-taping. You'll be able to live your life. You'll be able to not sit in traffic for 2.5 hours, just walk in and say one line for 30 seconds and leave. You will be able to take a vacation without fear of missing an opportunity. I mean, there's so many work-life balance benefits to
Mm.
self-taping, not to mention people who have audition nerves or anything like that. It can really be a huge benefit.
I agree with you, and I think there's two sides of the confidence that we've developed at this point with self tapes. One is the actor side, right? So many actors have now gotten to this point where they're much more familiar with it. They understand that they need to get better at it. They understand the fundamentals in order to create a good tape so that they can get it off, whatever is necessary for them so that they can do that. But then there's the other side, which is that casting and producers and directors and the whole other side of the industry that views the tapes is much more familiar with viewing the tapes.
Yes.
Whereas before, yes, you might have been out of town. I've done this. I have, many examples of shooting stuff when I'm on vacationing at the beach and maybe I'm a little sunburned or something like that.
Sure.
When I'm vacationing somewhere else and I have to go find a room in a hotel to shoot something like with my wife or whatever, like we got to find some little quiet conference room or something, and it is what it is, but like at least you can get it done.
Uh-huh.
So there's that necessity, and understanding the fundamentals will allow you to create a good tape. But then the ability to say to an agent or say to casting or whatever, hey, so and so's out of town, they can't make the live in person thing, can they submit a tape? Now it's going to be more common that the answer to that is yes. If they can get it here by this time on this day, then the answer is yes, because casting is more familiar viewing these tapes. They're more familiar getting these tapes from actors. They're more familiar seeing tapes that are of a higher quality. Whereas before, maybe 2 years ago or something, when someone said that, they're like, oh man, Now I got to like listen to something that sounds terrible. They got terrible lighting, and I got to try to waste my time essentially making a judgment call on this.
Right.
Most of that is out the window. We've evolved past that point. So now both parties are actually more confident with the tapes, I think.
Yeah. And, for a lot of us in casting, we have been casting off tape for a really long time.
Mm.
It's just that people have declined the option prior to this because they felt it didn't give them a fair shake. It didn't give them a fair chance. Well, how can I compete with people who go in the room? And the reality is, you've always had the same opportunity because A, we're used to watching tapes, but B, our producers have gotten very used to watching everything on tape. So like I said, I moved to the Southeast at the end of 2017. My last real producer sessions were in 2014.
Wow.
All of my producers have been watching things off tape since then. And some even before that, where they were just like, we trust that you're going to send us your favorites, that you're going to send us the best possible people for this role. If it doesn't work, we'll tell you and we'll collaborate on what we need to do next. But it allows them to be in the writer's room all day, or be in the scout van all day, or would take meetings, or be on notes call. They always have friggin' notes calls with the studio and the network and things like that. It allows them to do all of those things without losing a chunk of time. That time is always when they have to eat food. And so they can't eat food during casting. They know it's rude. And it's just, it's juggling all of these different things. And this is the one of those things that they can push off to 9 p.m. at night, midnight, the scout van, whatever. And so they have started watching tapes as well. And the difference is that, of course, half the tapes or more are people who were reading in person. So they're hearing the same reader. It's, us. But we were including self tapes all the time because they were watching everything on tape anyway. So, I think that is something to remember as well, is that, producers don't mind it. For, I think some directors mind it, that, the directors are like, I want to be able to have the immediacy and, whatever. But producers are like, I have 8 million things I have to do today. And this I can do in bed, in my pajamas, or while I'm eating. And it makes a big difference for them. So I know we've sort of talked about this before, but I don't see it going away anytime soon. It has been a game changer for a long time, for people who have been out of town, for people who have had sick kids and can't get a babysitter. And, for people who've got 5 appointments today and can't schlep all over town. If you're in Los Angeles, you know what I'm talking about. All of those things are meaningful. And so I think you will still see self-taping be a part of the process, even if it's just a part and not the entire process, but it's not going away. There's no way. It's changed things for everybody.
Yeah, I certainly agree with you. I mean, again, it's when it comes to anything, and you mentioned the producers, and they have a lot of sway, to be fair. Yes, the director has a certain amount of sway too. But producers, are really the people who ultimately pay attention to the bottom line, right? And the bottom line becomes very important in these projects as money is trying to be, I don't want to say saved, but certainly watched very closely up into production, because production ends up being, one of the most expensive things you can do. So things are watched very closely up until that point in time. So if we've had this experience of saving money over this period of time, making things streamlined, making things easier, having more choices with less expenses, there's not a producer in the world that would want to go back to the other way. It doesn't make a lot of sense business wise. And you have to remember that you're in show business. This is all part of a money making endeavor for these producers and everybody else involved, the other stakeholders. So if there's a way to make that early process more efficient, the casting process, then they're definitely going to side with that whenever possible. But that does bring me to a question that we've had come up in the group and had other people ask about, which I think is useful talking about, this in the room experience, right? So the producers definitely have been removed from that process, but you have mentioned that sometimes some directors, not all, most people understand the situation now, and ultimately you're working with a performance that ends up on camera anyway.
Sure.
But there is this idea of well, I'm so great in the room, like,
Right.
and what do you say to an actor who has this argument, or really I think it's an excuse, but this argument in the back of their head that's like, what I don't like about the self-tape thing is I can't come in and be my charming self to the casting director and therefore have that somehow influence my audition to a certain extent. Does it matter? What are we talking about here ultimately?
I mean, listen, I love seeing actors in person. I certainly love seeing some of my favorite people in person. I mean, we're
Who
all
doesn't?
artists. Yeah, we're all artists. We love the hugs. We love the camaraderie and whatever. And especially there's some of us that have known each other for a very, very long time. So it's always a delight to see those people in person. But that said, my loving you as a human being is not necessarily going to get you the job. My finding you to be a complete jerk will preclude you from getting the job.
Your tape won't get shown.
Exactly. Yeah,
so it won't even be a conversation that the producers ever hear.
Right.
They're also not going to hear the other side, which is you were like, they brought me coffee. I mean, they're really fun.
No, of course.
They're not going to hear that. That's not part of the job.
It's not. And the reality is, like, again, we're precluding we're not sending forward anybody who has been a jerk, right? Like, if it back in the live audition days, if you came into our office and you were rude to our assistant, or you were rude to other actors in the waiting room, or you were rude or did something dangerous in our office or something like that, that will preclude you from going forward. We're not sending anybody to set who's going to be difficult to work with. That said, the assumption is everybody else is pleasant to work with. So with that, that's what we're operating under. And so, I've had producers ask in the past, how do you know, that the tape that you're sending us or that they sent to you is not the 100th take? How do you know that they can take a note? How do you know that they're not going to be a jerk? And that's up to us. That's up to us to do our due diligence, to familiarize ourselves with your resume, with your reel, with your other work, to connect with you online if that's something we need to do, if we've never met you before and we want to see how you take a note. All of those things fall into our purview as casting directors, because we don't have the immediacy of walking in and having a 3-second chat with you before we start. So
which is limiting in its own right, to be fair as well.
Of course.
You're not going to learn everything about somebody, certainly if you've never met them before in those.
And for the most part, you're going to be on your best behavior for that anyway. So, it's a gauge that's not that vital. At the end of the day, the thing that gets you the job, whether you're coming in person or you're doing a tape, is the work. And that's what will get you the job. Are you the right fit for this role? Did you bring something to it that got all of us viewers that, on the creative team? Did you stir us? Did you make us laugh? Did you make us feel something? Did you, any of those things? And your personality matters, because again, we want to make sure that you're going to be pleasant to work with, especially now things are so stressful on set. But we're operating under the assumption that you are pleasant to work with. And, our own experiences, or, like, inevitably I'll get a note from a producer sometimes about somebody who was difficult or didn't know their lines or showed up late or whatever. And I clock that, I remember, and sometimes we'll call the reps about it. But otherwise, we are functioning as if you are professional and pleasant, if we don't already know you. And your body of work speaks to that as well. If you've worked before, if clearly the same producers or casting people have hired you again and again, that shows that you're a good person to work with. So I think the whole thing of I'm so much better in the room, I think that doesn't pertain so much to, like, I'm so personable in the room. That pertains to, I can take a note really well in the room, and when I self-tape, I don't get that. And I'm missing that. And I think people are sort of substituting the energy of the room, of the camaraderie of the room, with the direction you get in the room, which is obviously missing from self tapes, which I know drives actors nuts and sometimes drives us nuts as well. But that is just a piece of the puzzle. How do we overcome it? That's kind of up to us. Do we do virtual casting sessions? Do we give redirects to have them retape? Do we, any of those things? Again, that sort of falls into our court to figure out how best to manage that.
Right. That's your professional prerogative, so to speak,
Right.
as casting, that you now get to make this decision. I think, to your point here, we'll talk about this sort of callback or virtual live casting, which is usually done for callbacks or chemistry reads or anything like that. And we'll talk about that in just a second. But I want to highlight something that you kind of point out here, which is that, like, if self-tapes are not going away, then certainly in the near term future, I think what makes a lot of sense, if in-person casting is presented in some sort of way, that it's mostly going to be callbacks in the in-person casting, because now you're bringing in far fewer people into the office.
Right.
My camera will kick back on in just a second here. But you're bringing far fewer people into the office. You're, reducing that exposure and all these other things that we're all sort of very much aware of now. The office rental time and paying for people's parking, all this other crap that goes along with the production side of things is now reduced. And that's because you've been able to do the self-tapes, because the self-tapes are high enough quality, because the self-tapes that you're able to get from the actors that you're able to source are good enough, and there's plenty of them, that you can make the appropriate decisions to get to that callback point where you're like, okay, now if we do want to do an in-person setup, then we can do that. And then an actor has an opportunity to win the room. Only why? Not because, again, not your personality, right? Necessarily. It's your ability, as you said, to take a note, your ability to work live on the project, on the material, with someone's direction, which most of the time is just to see how, especially if they're unfamiliar with you, how are you going to be able to work in this production-like environment where someone's like, great, that was a good take, but we'd like to go in this direction. Can you use your actor brain to translate what they mean and go, okay, well, let me try something. How familiar and facile are you with that? Because that's what production requires.
That's exactly right.
Right.
And that's the thing, is that, I was talking with some producers of my next project, and they were asking, do you want to do live sessions? And I was saying to them, and I'm vaccinated, and I'm sure at least some of the production team is vaccinated as well. I was like, we're still casting rooms are still small. We are still getting energy and air and spit shot our way during these things. So if we're going to do it, we need a large space. We need to be able to spread out. We need to make sure that we have a waiting system so that actors can wait somewhere safely. They're not crowded into a little lobby together. We have to make sure that we've got enough space between them and us. All of those things still matter, whether or not we're vaccinated. We can't ask you if you're vaccinated. So, we have to operate under what is the safest precaution here? What's the safest way to do this? And so they are going to reserve those experiences because they're not ideal. They're going to reserve those for the things that really matter, the callbacks, the chemistry reads, if we absolutely need to see what it's like to work with this person in the immediacy. But in the meantime, so many of them have gotten used to directing over these platforms, these video platforms. So, it's hard to say what the future will hold in terms of when is it going to get busier for in-person auditions. I don't know. I don't think anybody can answer that.
I know some people in Los Angeles are saying that that's already starting to pick up. But again, like, different markets will operate differently, and certainly different sections of the market. Maybe commercials are picking up a little bit more than production, than theatrical production is.
Right.
Which I think is actually what this actor who I heard speak about that was referring to.
Right. And commercials have been doing in-person stuff for a while during the pandemic. And they figured it because they need it. That, self-taping for a commercial is not easy. Right. Especially, like sometimes you need certain props, you need certain, whatever, you need things that you don't necessarily have. So it was a priority for them, and they figured out how to do it in a safe way where, like, this is the this is the, login system. You wait in your car and we wipe things down, whatever.
Right.
But they have session runners, right? So they're not even having all of their people in the room. They're limiting it as much as possible. And then everybody's watching tapes. So it's the same idea. And I think, again, for theatrical, the only benefit to doing something in the room with me, specifically with me, because again, if we're limiting people and my producers are like, you just read with people and we'll watch the tapes later. The only difference between me doing something in person with somebody versus me doing something over Zoom or EcoCast Live or We Audition is that sometimes the internet glitches. Like that's the difference. But I can still get a sense of somebody over this. I mean, that's the whole point of this, is that we can see and hear each other really well. If this pandemic had happened
in real time, have that
Yes.
real world conversation where you speak to somebody and you're like, they don't seem to understand what I'm saying, or they seem to be inexperienced enough that they're not quite going where we need them to go, or moving as quickly as we need them to move, or whatever. And you get that sense because you're in a real time environment.
Yes, exactly. If this pandemic had happened in 2004, we'd been screwed. But it happened in 2020. So we're lucky enough to benefit from the technology that's around, and it's only evolved in the last year. So, we'll see what happens. I don't, nobody's got any answers to when things are going to get busier in person versus virtual.
Yeah, I agree. This is outstanding info. So thank you very much. And while we still have just some of your time, I'm going to jump into some live questions, which I think might be pretty exciting. We've got Aaron here dropping a question, asking, and I believe he's asking about slate shots, which I know that you've shared some quite good examples of. So I'll give you the freedom to dive into that. But his question is, what's the best way to include a full length or wide shot? He says, I see a lot of requests for this, but not sure if I'm doing it correctly. Maybe he is talking about maybe a wider shot if, I don't know,
full body.
For whatever reason the project calls for that. But I'd love to hear the answer to both of these, actually.
So there's no easy way to do this at home without you feeling A, like an idiot, or B, like you are showing off too much of your messy apartment or whatever. The best way that I can advise people to do this is to turn your phone vertically for that thing. Okay. It's going to save you a lot of space. You just have to make sure that it's not messing with the aspect ratio of your audition, which is landscape mode, that you're not losing anything there, that, the aspect ratios are two different things. That will save you a lot of heartache right off the bat. Mm-hmm. But what I've told some people, because so many people in the pandemic don't live with anybody, you don't have anybody to help you get wide enough to do whatever you need to do. The best thing for me that I have seen is that people will insert a photo, a full body photo. And so they'll give me all the Slate information that I need, because the information is important. Hi, I'm Erica Bream. I'm 5'5". I'm based in blah, blah, blah. I'm rep by blah, blah, blah. I'm whatever other information you have to do. They do it in whatever frame they can do it in. So usually it's semi close up. And then they cut to or do a side-by-side image of a full body photo. And it's easy enough to set this thing on a bookcase, press self timer, step back and take a full body photo when you're all by yourself. So for me, that checks the box. That's all I need. The reason we ask for full body photos, it's not to drive you crazy or to make you feel like we're looking you up and down or anything like that. It's because we're only seeing you from the chest up. And it's just helpful for us to see you as a full 3-dimensional human being with a lower half. So it's just for perspective. That's all. It's not meant to make you feel grotesque or like I said, an object of that we're staring at or whatever. That's why, pan shots, they're not great for that reason. They're so awkward. It really feels like you're giving somebody a once over. We're looking for you to fulfill this brief in the simplest way possible. And sometimes just either turning your phone vertically or taking a few steps back, pressing self timer and including a photo will do the job.
Yeah. And I definitely want to shout out, your Instagram account, which has shared in the past some great examples of it. I've actually even shared some of those examples in this self-tape mastery group, because I think they're great, great middle grounds that people have found, right? So as an example, just to point it out, I mean, what everybody is watching our current conversation here, we're in a landscape setup, right? And there's one screen on one side of there's one image on one side of the screen and one image on the other. You can do the same thing in iMovie or whatever editing program very simply that you use to before you send your self tape off. If you have to have a full body photo or slate or something like that, you can do, as you say, take that image, take a picture, a current picture, by the way, not something that is older. It needs to be your current face, current head, haircut,
ideally
current
it's the same
tan
day that you tape.
Exactly. Ideally the day that you tape. If it's preferably in the same outfit, so everyone's confident that it's the same day, right? It's the same you. But you drop that image into iMovie or whatever, and you align it right alongside your video, right? Or the slate rather. So if you're there, hey, I'm Mike Moreno, 5'9", living in New York. Right next to that would be the image that I took, and it's just sitting there for the 3 seconds that it takes me to do my slate. And then boom, both go away. And now you're into the full aspect ratio of your actual audition.
Yep.
Or if you do the slate at the end for whatever reason, then that's how it goes. But it's very simple, very easy to do. And if you want to do a video version of that full slate, then it's the same setup. It's just two videos laid up right on top of each other. I know Aaron was saying that he puts his phone in portrait mode and then he fills the dead space with sidebars of the same color, he says.
Oh yeah, I've seen some people do
as
that.
as my backdrop, right? So that it's it's widescreen.
Right. You don't even need to do that. You don't need to get that fancy. It's fine.
There you go.
It's fine if there are black bars there. It's all good. But that works too. But I think that, that the thing is people overthink their slates because they're so worried about getting even the tiniest thing wrong. Your slates are for information, okay? They don't need to be perfect. They're not a test of how clean you keep your house or your cinematography skills or your editing skills or whatever. We need the information. And part of that information is often a full body image of you. And so how can you do this in a way that works for you, works for us? That's what you want to think about.
Yeah. And lastly, Erica, I'd love to ask one last question, which I think is useful. And sometimes I've heard both sides of this. Basically, how many takes should an actor send? Right. So we just talked about in the room, we talked about getting direction. Sometimes that gives you 2 chances to do your audition, maybe 3 chances to do your audition, depending on what's going on. Probably not any more than that. But I have talked to actors who are outside of the traditional marketplaces, not in Los Angeles, not in New York, actors who maybe live outside in New Mexico, right? Or maybe outside somewhere else. And if they're sending tapes, especially if it's to somebody new, right? And maybe probably for something short, right?
Sure.
1 page, 2 page things, that they might send 2 different takes. That if it's okay, so I'm going to read it this way, and I'm pretty confident in that, but I don't know this person from Adam. This is maybe a film that I'm auditioning for. Maybe it is a commercial or something else, short. And it could go the other way. So let me send a second take. Now I'm literally taking up 2 minutes of their day, right? 3 minutes max of their day. But I'm getting 2 takes in there. What are your thoughts on that? Does it ever apply? Is it ever necessary? And how does one tell if it's necessary and if it's useful?
So at the end of the day, you only need one great take to book the role. That's it. And what happens is a lot of times when people do more than 1 take is that they split their choices in an effort to get 2 different takes. And if they had actually married those choices together, they'd have 1 pretty bomb ass take. So you have to be careful with it. It's not, if you're using it just to show us range, you might be working against yourself. Remember that we also have access to your reel and your resume and other things like that. If we need to see a different take, we can always ask for an alternate take. The ones where I am always happy to see more than 1 take are the small roles, the co-stars, the one-liners, anything small where all of a sudden it's over and I'm like, wait, is that it? Is there anything else?
Yeah.
They're less defined. They have more movement there for you to play with that still works in an authentic, organic way that's totally appropriate to the piece. Whereas if you're trying to make an adjustment on a 3-page guest star, a 5-page series regular, whatever, you're starting to split some hairs there because you've got more meat on the page to help you make those decisions right off the bat. It's not to say that there's only one take of anything. I mean, obviously, you've all been on sets, you know that there are different ways to play things. But that said, I think for the sake of a self-tape, which is already a game of overthinking everything, the best thing you can do for yourself is do the prep work as if you only got one shot at it. That's the same way that you would do if you went for an in-person audition. You can't assume you're ever going to get a note in an in-person audition, right? You have to assume that you gotta hit it right off the bat. And people do all the time. So you're capable of it. That is the best thing you can do for yourself, is prepare it as if this is the take.
Right.
And then as you're doing it, if you're like, you know what, I've discovered something else that I could play with that hasn't changed things that I cannot change, like the tone of the piece or whatever, play around with it. And then what I usually tell actors, because people are like, should I send 2? Should I not? If you love 2 and they're short, send them both. If you love 1 and are like, well, this second one is different, maybe don't send that second one. You have to love it, because you don't want it to hurt what you've done in the other take. And not to say that it would, but if we happen to view that alternate take first and aren't enamored with it and don't realize there's another take there, we could miss your otherwise perfect take.
Oh my gosh, that brings up a question, which I'm just going to shove in here if you don't mind.
Yes.
And I don't remember if I've asked you this question or if I've asked another casting director this question, but I think it's a good one, which is sometimes you get an audition where there are maybe multiple scenes, right? And maybe you feel like one scene is showcases you better, right? But yet they've been given to you scene 1, scene 2, right? And you're like, man, if I could start with scene 2, that would be great. And sometimes in the in-person, or rather, shall we say, the live scenario, could be recorded. Sometimes they will say, like, you know what, we're not going to do scene 1, we're actually just going to do scene 2. So if you can go to that. So there's plenty of examples of where, you know, they give you both things to prepare, but there ends up being one favorite or one that's preferred. Now, in the self-tape scenario, we as the actor have an opportunity here to send something that is that showcases us better right off the bat. What are your thoughts on that, which is like changing the scene order just to ensure that that first thing they see is actually the strongest material?
So I'm a huge fan of you choosing what you want me to see first. Okay. I'm a big fan of that. I'm a firm believer. I mean, oftentimes, as you mentioned, in in-person auditions or in live auditions, an actor will say, can we start with whatever scene for emotional reasons, whatever, or because it's the most difficult and they just want to, excuse me, sorry, head cold. They just want to bang it out, whatever the reason, it doesn't matter. We're almost always flexible. I feel like I'm in the minority on this. I've talked with so many other casting directors, and of course, it's the support staff who really feels like they want your stuff in order, because if you send it out of order, they're the ones who have to change it to put it in order. And it drives them a little crazy.
Are they editing tapes? Are they looking at a tape that's good? Okay. Yes. Always. And they're editing it so it's in order for whoever has to view it on the other end?
Yes. So ideally, if you're doing that, your scenes are separate clips, because that's much more easy to manipulate. But
at that point, it doesn't even matter.
Exactly. Okay. And so that's why for me, I don't care. I have asked many times for actors to, you know, for me, it's series regulars, generally speaking. If I'm auditioning for series regulars and they've got multiple scenes, I say, put whatever scene you feel is strongest first, whatever scene you want me to see first. I might not agree, but this way you feel like, okay, that first scene to me is a slog. The second scene is the scene I connected with. I'm going to show Erica that first. You feel good about it. I'm excited about it. Let's see. And so I'm fine with it. But again, I think from what I've heard from my peers, I'm in the minority on that. So your best bet is to put them in the order that they appear for safety's sake. But when you upload something to Casted or EcoCast, sometimes they kind of go out of order just based on which one finishes uploading first. So like I said, I'm never mad when they're out of order. I just need them to be labeled properly.
Yes. And that was going to be a follow-up question on that. Absolutely. Label and make clear what it is that you're sending so that everybody is crystal clear on, the minute that fade comes up and you're like saying your lines, I'm sorry, what scene is this, right? We need to know, which is very important. But something you said, which I do want to highlight, which is that if you are in that live scenario, not necessarily in person, but in a live scenario, there is some level of control that you can bring. So there is an ability to ask a question like, hey, we've got two scenes here. I'm really jazzed about the second scene. I'm really excited about that. I'd love to start with that if that's possible. Would that be okay? I don't, is there a better way to ask that question? I don't know. But I think that's totally reasonable. But you also have to be prepared if they're like, no, thank you. Or we're actually not even going to do that scene. We're going to do the first one. So that's what we're going to do.
Right,
you have to be okay with going, all right, great. Then we're going to do what we want. You want to do.
That's exactly right. You can't marry yourself to the outcome of that question, right? Yeah. Like it's like you said, sometimes we're like, oh, we're not doing that scene anymore, or whatever. And you don't want to be so jazzed up to do this scene first and then hear no, or we're not doing that scene anymore, and then be like, where do I go from here?
Yeah, and then that throws you off and you get in your head about it.
Exactly.
Now you're effing the one that you could have done well.
Exactly.
Control what you can control, forget about the rest. I always like to say on the podcast.
For sure.
So one last question from the live audience. Pablo says that he's up in Canada, actually in Toronto. Just moved there. Moved from Toronto to Vancouver, but is doing a lot of submitting right now because he's without an agent in this move. And some of those submissions are going to the US. Is that even something that's being considered right now? Folks from out of the country, is it maybe being overlooked because of COVID, or is there a better time to think about this?
It's not a great time to try to come from out of the country into the country. Different countries have different rules. I was talking to somebody who's not in the industry at all, but she was trying to get people in from Canada to do a summer job here in town. And she was like, we can't get them to come because they're not vaccinated at the same rate.
That's right.
That we are. And when they go back, they have to quarantine, and we don't have the resources to help them with that and whatever. And so what I would say to you is wait a beat on that. It's a really tricky time to get non-citizens into this country safely. I'm just,
no, it's a good question, but we are in a tricky time, and it will pass, but we have to give it some time to do that, and to spend your energy working on that might not work out for you.
I think save yourself the heartache. Honestly, it's very complicated. It might cause you more expense and time than you anticipate. And as Mike just mentioned, it's going to get better. So the best thing you can do is kind of sit tight and focus on the country in which you are currently residing and what's available to you there, and then eventually open back up to other places.
Yeah, build relationships, certainly connect with people, take their workshops. If you see Erica online, follow her lives, right? Go, check in, build that relationship and awareness, but know that for submitting for projects is probably going to be something you're not going to want to spend your energy doing at this time until everybody is much clearer on. There's a much clearer capacity to do so, to bring people in.
Right.
Good stuff. Erica, I'm going to give you back the rest of your, Wednesday night. Thank you so much for coming on live and sharing your insight.